Welcome to Whispers at Night. Can't sleep? Curl up and listen. I'll share quiet, eerie stories while the rain falls out into your window. Subscribe. Join our little night crew and hit like if you enjoy the chill. Ready? Let's begin. I wasn't sleeping much that summer. Rent late, fridge hollow, every knock sounding like someone there to collect. I'm Harlan and I was working anything I could find. Roof tear-offs, hauling feed, moving pallets, none of it steady. Then my buddy Nico called. Said his uncle out in the Appalachian Mountains needed help fixing up a place. Cash. A week. Maybe less. He's odd, but he pays, Nico told me. I didn't ask for a contract. I needed gas money and groceries, not a lecture on red flags. I threw boots, a flashlight, a busted multi-tool, 2 cans of chili, and a bedroll in a backpack. That was the kit. Nico said to meet his uncle at an old gas station 2 hours east of Asheville. Be there by 6:30, he texted. He'll find you. The station looked like a relic. One light stuttering over dead pumps, windows filmed with dust, moths batting themselves to death against glass. No traffic, no chatter, just the buzz and my own heartbeat. When the Suburban rolled in behind me, dented 2 doors a different color from the rest, hood furrowed like a plow had run over it, I knew it had to be him. 2 black dogs sat upright in the back, big as calves. Didn't pant, didn't blink. The driver climbed out. A tall man with bark-dry skin and shoulders like cut stone. Royce, he said, like it was both introduction and verdict. No handshake, no small talk. He looked me over the way you check a tire you don't trust and said one word. Follow. We drove. Pave became gravel. Gravel became dirt. Dirt became a ribbon that looked sketched into the trees with a dull pencil. Every bend was another copy of the last. Branches tapped my roof like a count I couldn't keep. I stopped checking the clock after the first hour. The dogs never shifted. The woods kept swallowing whatever was ahead, then spitting us into another tight tunnel of green. We reached a clearing just past 9:15, if the dash clock was right. The cabin stood in the dead center like it had been dropped there and forgotten. Not cute, rustic, tired. Listing. 1 porch post half snapped, roof patched with a faded tarp, windows clouded with a skin of grime. The boards hissed under our boots like they didn't want us there. Inside smelled like wet lumber and something animal that had gone wrong. Royce pointed with his chin, not words. That room, he said to me, indicating a closet-sized space with a sagging mattress and no window. A chrome clothes rack rusted to brown rested over a paint bucket. A yellowed rope looped from the rack to a nail in the wall. I must have stared too long. Royce said, ask once if you need something, like he was reading a policy off a card, then added, bathrooms through there. Don't touch the radio. It wasn't a radio you could miss. Steel box with knurled knobs, the kind of thing you see in photos with men in headsets leaning toward it. A wire ran out the window, jacket chewed or cut, I couldn't tell. It looked older than the roof. Morning came gray. Royce handed me a hammer and a belt of nails, then watched the tree line while I tore soft boards off the porch. He didn't hover, didn't instruct, just stopped sometimes mid-swing to squint into the trees like he expected something to step out and correct him. See something? I asked once. He said, nothing worth naming, and that was that. The first night I learned about the walls. It was late. The dogs settled like statues in the living room. I'd propped the rack against my door so nothing could open it easy. Sometime after my head finally went light, I snapped awake to a rhythm. Scratch, 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 right where my bed pushed against the wall. Not scrambling, counted, held the beats, a loop. I lay still with the blanket up to my chin and followed the pattern until it stopped so suddenly, the silence felt staged. In the morning, there was only old paint and a stain the color of tea behind the headboard. I told myself mice, a big raccoon maybe. Then I noticed the dogs. There had been 2. Only one stood by Royce's leg. Lose one? I asked. He cut me a look. It isn't like that. That afternoon, he gave me a stub of white chalk. Mark your door tonight, he said. 1 line. If it changes, wake me. How's a line change? He didn't answer. He was already scanning the pines again, jaw set like he was listening for a word he refused to say. I did as told. Drew a line waist high across the plank door. then wedged the rack back under the knob. Sometime after midnight, the generator coughed out and the house exhaled into black. The boards outside spoke in slow drags, boot soles, not paws, crossing the porch. Something bumped the siding where my head was. Then came a knock. 1, space 5 more. Too patient to be a joke. One of the dogs gave a short, strangled bark that turned to a scream I have no way to describe. It stopped like a hand had closed a valve. The other dog went quiet as dirt. I lay on the floor with both palms on the chalk line, as if pressure could keep it true. Something slid along the outside wall. Then inside my room, feet. Bad wet. A cautious pad. Then another. Like it was testing the boards with its weight. Breath threaded through the door seam. When the whisper came, it was like someone in another room trying to copy a word they'd only heard once. Ha, Lan. Close enough to my name to turn my stomach. Wrong enough to make my skin hurt. Morning tasted like metal. Sun found its way through the one clean place on the window of the main room and turned dust to glitter. The surviving dog was gone. Royce had a shotgun across his back and dirt ground into the creases of his hands like he'd been burying something or digging it up. He stared past me. It got closer, he said. Take the ATV, leave for the day. Leave to where? Out, he said. I'll call you when it's time. There isn't any service. His mouth twitched like it wanted to be a smile and couldn't remember how. Not that kind. I rode the ATV until the trail lost interest in existing. Killed the engine by a creek and sat on a flat rock, listening to the water say the same thing over and over to itself. Should have been peaceful. All I could hear was a knock I hadn't asked for replaying in my skull. I ate a cold spoonful of chili, dry swallowed it, and told myself I'd leave at first light, cash or not. When I came back after dark, the cabin lights were on. The shotgun was gone from the pegs beside the door, and so was Royce. The radio in the corner hissed a thin, steady line of static like a snake too lazy to strike. I called his name once. It made the room smaller. I chalked the door again. Stacked what little furniture there was, chair, milk crate, the rack, into a makeshift barricade. Sat on the mattress with the flashlight in my lap and didn't blink enough. At some point I must have. I know because when the generator died, sudden like a throat cut, I could hear the house breathing. The knob turned a fraction, stopped, turned back. Then the barefoot steps again, only this time they were already inside. They came up beside the bed and stood. The whisper worked the seam around my name until it got it perfect, right down to the lazy way I flattened the first vowel. Harlan, it said in my own cadence. There's a hole in my memory after that. Maybe I fainted. Maybe I slept with my eyes open and let something look back. Dawn crept under the door like it was afraid of the room. My chalk line was gone. Rubbed a powder up and down the planks as if palms had searched them. The floor was damp, not with spilled water, but with the smell of wet leaves and old well water. My pillow smelled like dirt. Royce did not come back that day, or the next, or any day I waited. I packed before the sun had the nerve to clear the trees. On my way out, I told myself not to look, and of course I looked. 3 things I don't have a box to put in. First, sometime in the night, all the furniture had been stacked in the middle of the living room. Balanced edge to edge, chair upside down on the crate. The rack threaded through the chair legs in a way you'd need 3 sets of hands to manage. I hadn't heard a screw roll. Second, on the porch, under full sunshine, boards creaked in a circle around me. Long, slow drags like boots being pulled across the wood. No one there. The sound made the hairs on my wrists stand up like static. Third, while I was replacing a rotten board by the stove, I'd pried up a section of floor that felt wrong. Underneath, wrapped in oil-stained cloth that had once been white, was a dress. Heavy and old and still wet enough to stick to itself. I put it back. I didn't unfold it. I didn't want to know what color the wet really was. I hiked out until my phone finally found a bar and called Nico. Same station, I told him. Pick me up. I left the key on the nail where I'd found it and didn't look back at the radio, which had started to whisper like it wanted to practice a new word. At the station, just before 10:45, I popped my trunk to shove my pack in and froze. 4 black smears across the inside of the lid, finger wide, oily, no smell. The kind of mark a palm might leave if it didn't have bones where you expect bones to be. Nico's uncle never asked about payment, and I never went looking. Every so often, a number I don't recognize calls once and hangs up. I let them. Sometimes when the apartment quiets in that particular way right before sleep, I hear a soft drag against drywall, like someone learning the shape of my walls by touch. If I get up and lean close, I can almost catch it. A whisper that wants to be a word, my name. It's better when it's wrong. I keep a chalk line inside my door now. I don't know what I'll do if it ever changes. I only know I'll see those mountains whenever I close my eyes. And the cabin listing there, patient as a held breath. The radio telling anyone who'll listen how to say me. I was 28 when I booked the cabin, and I was worn down to threads. My name's Rowan. I'd just crawled out of a 6-year relationship that made noise out of everything. Texts at all hours, constant planning, constant apologies. I wanted the kind of quiet that isn't just the absence of sound, but the kind you feel press against your ribs. Western North Carolina seemed like it could sand me back to myself. This wasn't Instagram cabin country. No hot tub under string lights. The listing was basically a paragraph and a phone number. The owner, Hale Mercer, told me to meet him at a little country station that smelled like diesel and fryer oil. I left Knoxville around 11:30 a.m. with a tote of paperbacks, a sack of groceries, and the old camp stove I never used. 2 hours later, the mountains shouldered closer, and the radio gave up. I rolled into the station a little after 3:15 p.m. Hale was waiting by a mud-splattered pickup, tall, sun-creased. The kind of hands that always look like they're holding a tool even when they're empty. He handed me a ring of keys and said, "Tire swing marks your turn." It felt less like directions and more like a warning. But I nodded like I got it. The dirt road did that mountain thing where it stops being a road and starts being a guess. Branches brushed the roof. The air cooled a few degrees and smelled like creek stones. When the trees finally stepped back, the cabin was there in a little bowl of land, leaning a touch like it had sat too long on one hip. 2 blind windows, a clawfoot tub inside that looked scrubbed to a shine no one ever enjoyed. The first day and a half were what I thought I wanted. I cooked on the stove, walked a ridge until my chest burned good, read until the words fuzzed. At night I soaked in the tub until the water slid toward cold, and my skin went goose-pimpled. There was a high window that faced the forest. Old wavy glass that warped the trees into slow, breathing shapes, even when the wind died. I loved that window until I didn't. I remember the generator because it made a low, helpful thrum. It sounded like company without conversation. Sometime deep in the second night, about 2 in the morning by the glow of my watch, the thrum cut out. The silence it left wasn't peace. It was heavy, like a blanket thrown over my head. I pulled on boots, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped into a cold that felt wet even with no rain. The generator sat under its lean-to like a stubborn animal. The gas can was heavy. I yanked the cord. Nothing. Again, nothing. The woods held their breath with me, and then I heard it. A sound that wanted to be a bark but didn't commit. Somewhere between a cough and a single word set into a sleeve. 3 light taps followed, spaced like someone thinking between them. Tap. 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 Wood on wood. Then nothing. I shut the light off like that could make me invisible, and stood there counting my heartbeat until I understood I was shaking. I went back inside, dropped the wooden bar across the door, and sat with my back against it. The warped glass made the trees outside look like they were breathing on purpose. Morning made me brave. I hiked up until I caught a bar of service and called Hale. I told him the generator was being weird, and left out the part about the tapping. He said he'd swing by around 7:45 p.m. When the truck rumbled into the clearing later, he hopped down, pulled the cord once, and the generator coughed back to life like it had been waiting for him to watch. "Floods," he said. "Old machines sulk." Then he tilted his head at the tree line the way a dog listens for its name. "You hear anything?" "No," I lied, and even I could hear how thin it sounded. "Could be coyotes," he said, which would have been comforting if his eyes hadn't stayed on the trees while he said it. That night, I staged the bed like a little fort. Flashlight on the bedside table. Pepper spray where my hand would fall. The fireplace poker leaned within reach. When the generator quit again, right at 2 this time like it had read a schedule, silence came down so fast I could hear the blood in my ears. The porch flexed, one board, then the next. the way boards do when someone puts their weight on them careful. The steps came slow, patient. When they reached the window, 3 knuckles knocked. Tap, tap, tap. A voice followed, flat, no smile. Let me in. Cold, no pleading, no swearing. Just a statement from someone who already knew I was listening. I pressed myself against the wall and didn't answer. Didn't breathe for a few seconds too many. The steps faded the way fog thins, everywhere at once and then gone. In the morning, the porch held nothing but grit. I called Hale and asked if hikers ever got turned around back there. His pause made it worse than a yes. There's a trail. Sometimes it's not people like you mean. He came at dusk with a little cloth bag. Inside, coarse salt, twine, a brass bell that felt heavy for its size. We poured salt in clean lines along both door sills, and he tied the bell to a nail above the porch, like it had always hung there. If it rings, he said, don't look. Don't answer. What are we keeping out? They don't have a name, he said, eyes on the dark between the trees. Or maybe they don't keep the same one. That night I slept in my clothes. Around 2, because that's when everything liked to fail, the generator died. The bell moved once like it was thinking about it, then again soft like a fingertip. Then faster, 2 notes that didn't match the wind. Footsteps dragged across the planks, slow, heelless. The voice came from the back wall this time, as casual as before. You left the back open. I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. I turned the flashlight on and the bulb popped with a mean little sting like it had been waiting to spite me. The bell went still. I sat in the grayed-out dark and counted to 100, then 200, then stopped pretending numbers did anything. Daylight made 3 new rules. The woods were unnaturally quiet in the bright hours, as in the insects went silent too. I stood there in that big hush and could feel the quiet noticing me back. Another afternoon I woke from a hard, grudging nap with my fist clenched around hair. Long black strands, damp the way river rock is damp. My hair is light. I was alone. I slid the hair under the mattress and used the back of my shirt to wipe my palm until the smell went away. The last morning I found a ledger on the shelf, a guest book I hadn't noticed. Names neat as medical charts, check-in dates that stretched back to when men wrote the same 3 fancy loops for every R. No checkouts. The most recent entry was older than my parents. I packed before the sun even thought about leaving the ridge. I didn't look into the woods long enough to let my eyes invent faces. The dirt road gave me back to pavement like a dog drops something it's not supposed to have. I drove until the signs turned green again, and the radio found a station that only played ads for tractor parts. Hale stopped answering calls. The listing disappeared like a misspelling someone corrected. This would be the place where the story ends if not for the echoes that refuse to mind their own business. Every now and then, as I'm falling asleep, a brass note flicks the air, just one, thin as a hair, and my whole body goes stupid and still. Sometimes I wake with grit under my tongue like I've been grinding my teeth on salt. Twice I've found the flashlight beside my bed with a burnt bulb I don't remember using. And once, only once, the voice came back as steady as a clock. Let me in. I'm cold. I keep telling myself the rule is simple. Don't look. Don't answer. Keep the line of salt clean and the deadbolt turned. But there are nights the quiet swells so big it feels like an ocean leaning on my door, and I start to understand why someone would open it just to make the pressure stop. I haven't. Not yet. I tell myself I won't. But I know what time the generator of an empty cabin likes to fail, and I know how a bell sounds when something touches it on purpose. And I know a voice can learn the exact weight of your name if you let it practice long enough outside. After 4 back-to-back overnights at the gas station, my head felt like it still hummed with ballast buzz. Receipts, mop water, old donuts, the whole fluorescent loop. Nate said his uncle had a hunting cabin out past Birch Hollow, tucked deep in the Appalachians. The uncle was one of those family reunion shadows. Gun oil smell, whiskey breath, 3 words an hour. The cabin was mostly empty these days. We could use it for the weekend. I said yes because I needed quiet, not because I wanted adventure. We pulled out of Maple Creek around 11:45 a.m. in Nate's patchwork hatchback. The blue door was from some junkyard Civic. The rear shocks grumbled at every seam in the highway. Clara and her boyfriend Ryan were supposed to join later. Clara texted that she'd close at work and follow in the evening. We turned off near a place with a hand-painted sign, Birch Hollow, and the road pinched into shoulderless blacktop that moved like a snake. No streetlights, no mile markers. Trees leaned in until they were basically a hallway. Then gravel, a mean ribbed track that slapped the undercarriage. Branches brushed both sides, dry fingers on tin. Almost there, Nate said, in a voice halfway between promise and apology. The clearing arrived all at once. The cabin squatted at the edge like it had been pushed there by the forest and told to stay. Single-story logs, weather black, a porch that sagged in the middle. One front window, one warped door with a handle polished by generations of dirty hands. A chimney like a broken tooth. Inside smelled like closed houses, dust, mothballs, mouse. The floors protested every step, antlers everywhere. A kerosene lamp sat on a scarred table like a stubborn old dog. The kitchen sink had a hand pump. "You gotta sweet-talk it," Nate said. The generator lived in a lean-to, a pull-cord brute that coughed awake on the sixth yank and settled into a sulky putter. No Wi-Fi, barely any service. One flicker of a bar if Nate stood very still in the driveway with his arm up like the Statue of Liberty. We'd packed like idiots. Cans of chili. Frozen stuff we couldn't cook yet. 2 cheap beer packs. And a stack of VHS tapes Nate found in his dad's garage. He'd brought a VCR the size of a small suitcase and a tiny TV that weighed more than it looked. He took the bedroom. I took the couch. We cracked beers, put on a bad kung fu movie, and drifted off. Sometime after midnight, the kind of black where your eyes give up, I woke to a silence that pressed on the room. The generator had died. No hum, no refrigerator click, just the woods breathing in. Then 3 knocks, not on the door, on the wall, a clean, measured thunk-thunk-thunk that came through the logs like it wanted in. Nate snored in the bedroom. I stayed still and counted my heart. A little while later, could have been 5 minutes, could have been 20, 3 knocks again. Then nothing. Light came slow and gray. The windows filmed with condensation like someone had leaned close and breathed on the glass. Out back, a narrow footpath stitched downward into leaves and shadow, just wide enough for a person to slip by. I asked Nate if he knew about it. He shook his head. Maybe my uncle cut it for deer. He didn't sound convinced. Around 12:30 p.m., Clara texted that they were leaving soon. "We'll be there by dinner." That was the last message that ever came through. Afternoon thinned into evening. Nate stood on the roof with his phone like he could spear a signal out of the sky. I told him not to worry. Maybe they stopped for food. The generator coughed itself to death again. When I crossed the kitchen to relight it, the back door, one we hadn't used, eased open and groaned like a bad knee. "Nate?" I called. No answer. I took the flashlight and peered into the clearing. Something pale slipped behind a tree. Thin, low to the ground. The movement wrong in a way that makes your stomach lean away before your brain catches up. I said hello without meaning to. No reply. Leaves shook once and then settled like a breath being held. The front door slammed and Nate came in sweating through his shirt. "You went out there?" I asked. He gulped air and nodded. I followed it. He rubbed his forearm like it hurt. "Didn't get close. It's smaller than I thought. Not a deer. Low." We argued in the hush you use in churches and hospital rooms. It felt like the cabin had ears. Morning brought gifts. 3 tin cans hung from a branch at the back steps, strung with red yarn, whispering against each other in the weak wind. We stared. The yarn had been wound and knotted with patience. Nate tore them down hard enough to burn the string into his fingers. He threw the cans into the fire pit and didn't look at them again. We waited for Clara and Ryan. We went roof signal fishing. Nothing. The sun slid behind the pines and the clearing got that sudden mountain chill that finds your ankles first. Night returned with new habits, knocking on the floorboards this time. 5 slow taps that you felt in your soles, then 5 on the back door. The rhythm had changed like someone wanted us to know they were learning. I grabbed Nate's sleeve and he flinched, which made me flinch, which made us both laugh wrong and sharp. At the tree line, something pale held the trunk of a pine. Fingers, if fingers can be described as too many and not enough at the same time. I screamed. Nate kicked the door shut so hard the frame rattled. We didn't talk after that. We packed flashlight, keys, tape stuffed back in the bag like any of it mattered. When we pulled down the rutted track, the headlights cut across that same branch by the steps. 5 fresh cans swung from the yarn, no wind, just motion. A couple of bends later, we saw Clara's car nosed into the ditch, passenger doors yawning open. Headlights off, interior light dead, phone charger curled like a worm on the console. "Stop," I said, and immediately said, "No, keep going." My voice didn't sound like mine. Nate eased, like his foot couldn't decide, and then he did what I asked. We rolled on. I watched the rear window until the trees took the car away. We didn't sleep. We reached the first town with a signal around 3:15 a.m. and sat in the lit parking lot of an all-night diner without going in. The lights felt like salvation and a headache. In the morning, Clara's parents called everyone. They'd woken up to a half-finished text and nothing since. Later, the sheriff's office found the car where we'd seen it. Clara's phone was shattered on the passenger seat. No blood, no footprints anybody could swear to, no Clara, no Ryan. Back at my apartment, the city sounds felt wrong, like someone had dubbed a new track over familiar film. I locked the door. Then I locked it again. It stays locked now, even when I'm home. Even when I take out the trash and come back in right away. Nate's still Nate, poking at explanations, coyotes, pranks, kids. He never says his uncle's name. I don't think he remembers it anymore, if he ever knew. Sometimes the frost on my window writes shapes I don't want to understand. Sometimes there's a soft crying in the trees behind the complex, a baby or someone doing a baby. Sometimes a voice that's not quite a voice whispers from the seam where the wall meets the floor. Leave before she wakes. People love to say the woods are empty. People say the mountains don't care. Both can be true, but empty isn't the same as safe, and indifference has teeth. If I tell this to strangers, it's for one reason. Curiosity loves to dress up like courage. It will walk you down a little leaf-covered path and tell you you're special for following. The woods are patient. They don't rush. They make little toys out of cans and string and see if you'll look. They knock until you knock back. Don't. I'm Rhea. That summer, my brother Calder sold me on the idea of vanishing for a long weekend. A reset button, he called it. I just quit a nightmare job and walked out of a slow erasure of a relationship. When he said, "Let's disappear," I didn't ask how far. He found a place on a half-broken rental site, Raven Hollow Lodge. One photo, dark logs, wraparound porch. Trees packed so close you could lean out and touch bark. Reviews were weirdly vague. Quiet, isolated, perfect if you like solitude. No address on the page, just a message thread with a host who answered in one-line replies. 5 of us were in. Me, Calder, his girlfriend Tamsin, and our friends Boaz and Ivor. It felt like a reunion disguised as therapy. We split into 2 cars. I rode with Calder and Tamsin. The guys followed. We left the city around 1 p.m., pavement giving way to patched county roads, then to gravel that narrowed until branches brushed both mirrors. Every mile, reception bars dropped off until the screen went blank. Somewhere past Gray Ridge, the woods started to feel like a closed door. Tamsin watched the tree line and said, mostly to herself, "No one should live out here." We rolled in about 4:45 p.m. The cabin looked older than the photo. Wood gone nearly, black, porch sagging. A rusted swing croaking when the breeze remembered it. Inside smelled like wet wood and coins. Heavy handmade furniture. A tiny battery radio that offered only static. No service, no Wi-Fi. The mountain felt sealed. That first night was almost nice. Ivor passed around edibles. Calder lined a cooler. With beer. We built a fire and stared up at a ridiculous sky. Boaz told us the usual folk stuff. Don't whistle after dark, don't answer your name if you hear it in the woods. Then he whistled, because of course he did. Tamsin didn't laugh. She kept checking the trees like they might check back. I crashed under a low, slanted ceiling with a dusty window at the back. The quiet had weight. No insects, no wind. Just a soft pressure you felt in your ears. Sometime deep in the night, I woke to a single step on the stairs. One slow board complaining, then nothing. I lay there trying to breathe without noise until the window went gray. At breakfast, Tamsin couldn't find her phone. She'd left it on the coffee table. Now it was gone. One of my socks had wandered off too. Boaz made a joke about the cabins. Foot fetish until he realized his watch wasn't on his wrist. We shrugged, pretended a cluttered night could explain it. It still felt wrong. We set out for a hike after the heat softened. No marked trail, just game paths and stubborn ferns. We found an old pickup, sunken to its axles, windows spidered from inside, doors somehow still locked. Evers circled it with his camera, then said we should go back. The walk home felt different. Trees seemed to lean in. Tamsin rubbed her arms, though it was July. That night I woke to the sound of something dragging across floorboards. Slow, steady pulls that stopped when I sat up. I aimed my flashlight under the bed. Dust, a lost bottle cap, nothing alive. I lay back down and didn't sleep again. Morning without Iver. Boots gone, jacket draped on a chair, bed neat like a display. We called his name until our voices thinned. Boaz found a single set of prints at the edge of the yard, Iver's tread definite, leading into the trees and then stopping as if the ground had said, "No farther." Calder tried the emergency call anyway. The phone burped a ring and died. We argued in low voices because the walls felt nosy. No one wanted to split up. We shoved the couch against the front door and a dresser against the back. Night folded in earlier than it should have. Somewhere between then and later, the power died. The battery radio coughed static and quit. When I peered through the side window, someone stood at the tree line. Bare-chested, pale, head cocked too far. Iver's shape with the wrong hinges. He raised a hand, slow, like a child practicing a wave. I backed away and didn't tell anyone what I'd seen until dawn. The road out was gone. Just grass and ruts like no tire had ever passed. Boaz snapped. He said he'd rather take his chances in the trees. He didn't make it 20 steps before the green shut behind him. We found his hoodie snagged on a branch later, torn like it had backed away. That day, bags went missing. Keys, too. Only one phone turned up, face down near the sink. Iver's. Tamsin played a video with trembling hands. A shot of his boots thudding. Beside the pickup, out-of-breath whispers. "They're not people. They copy. They take your face." Static swallowed the rest. Night again. Figures pressed to the glass, mouths slack, faces soft like clay that hadn't decided on a shape. Calder whispered, "That's Boaz." But nothing about the outline matched how he stood, how he carried his shoulders. The longer we stared, the more the faces learned. When daylight slid in, the windows were bare, just our smudges left behind. We followed the sun until the trees thinned and gravel found our feet. A truck finally slowed for 3 mud-streaked strangers waving like lunatics. The driver listened to Raven Hollow and shook his head. "Ain't nothing that way but timber," he said, and set us down at a junction with a payphone that had given up decades ago. After that, the group thinned the way groups do. Numbers change how brave you feel. I kept expecting to wake at home and find my sock on the floor and laugh at myself. Instead, I moved across the country within a month. Calder and Tamsin tried to stitch normal back together. We texted in bursts, then less. I haven't seen either of them since I left. Maybe distance is a kind of charm. I still don't know what we walked into. I know what it did. It took small things first. Phones, socks, a watch. Like it was testing what it could move without being seen. It learned the shape of us against the windows and practiced. It lured Iver with something or someone we couldn't see. It wore him badly at first, then better. By the last night, the thing in the glass had his tilt down, his lazy shoulder. If I'd opened the door, it would have perfected the rest. When I think about the cabin, it's not the big scares that come first. It's the petty wrongness. A chair turned upside down in a room no one went into. The radio, dead all day, waking. Just long enough to spit a clipped sentence from a decades-old broadcast about a name carved into beams. The marks on those beams glowing low when no one was directly looking. Faint lines like old Appalachia math. The well bubbling thick and metallic at, you'll think I'm being dramatic, midnight. We didn't draw from it after that. Mostly I think about the silence, not the peaceful kind, the ambush kind. The way the forest held its breath when we walked and exhaled when we stopped. How the road out erased itself like a whiteboard someone wiped with a sleeve. How time slid, afternoon becoming evening out of sequence, mornings stumbling in late. I kept Ivor's phone for a while. It would light up on its own and play footage from angles none of us had shot. Us from behind when no one was behind us. A hand on a doorknob when all hands were accounted for. I mailed it to a P.O. box, called or texted me from, and never heard another word about it. Sometimes people want a moral, like the woods owe them one. I don't have it. I have what helps me sleep. I don't whistle at night. I don't say yes when my name comes from the wrong direction. If I hear footsteps stop when mine stop, I go home. I don't rent places I can't find on a map. When I leave now, I note the time, the way the sky looks, which shoulder the sun touches. When I arrive, I do the same. We pulled out of the city around 1 p.m. and rolled up to Raven Hollow about 4:45 p.m. I remember those 2 times like pins on a corkboard. Everything between them stretches and blurs. Steps on stairs, faces at glass, the road that forgot it was a road. If you go looking for that cabin, I hope you don't find it. If you do, I hope you leave while the place still thinks you're not worth keeping. I couldn't remember my last full night of sleep. Sirens, delivery scooters, neighbors arguing through paper walls. Knoxville had started to feel like a bad loop. I'm Lena, and I booked a solo cabin to break the loop. The place came through a coworker named Jonas. Quiet guy, jittery, always wearing earbuds. At the break room, he slid me a folded note. A first name, a number, a Venmo. Say you're from me, he mumbled. No listing, no photos, no address until I sent a deposit. Sketchy? Yes. I sent it anyway. I pulled out of Knoxville around 12 p.m. on Friday. Highway lanes peeled away to 2-lane blacktop, then a skinny ribbon through hills. GPS worked until it didn't. Jonas's directions were the kind your grandpa gives. Past the fence post with the old boot, right at the mailbox with antlers. I rolled my eyes, then found the boot and the antlers exactly where he'd said. Pavement turned to gravel and the road rose like a dry creek bed. Trees leaned in. My Civic scraped twice. The cabin sat in a small clearing like the woods had spat it out and changed its mind. 1 room deep, porch listing, 2 windows warped by weather. A roof sag you could see from the driveway. No neighboring cabins. No hum of anything. I realized I hadn't seen another car in, who knows, an hour? My phone showed no service. The quiet felt thick, like a blanket I hadn't asked for. Inside, plank floors that talked with every step. Dust and old wood in the air. A bed shoved in the corner. A chair that had outlived several owners. A squat fridge, a wood stove with a temper. Closets with simple hook latches. No deadbolt. The sink coughed metallic water. I coaxed the stove to life. Smoke first, then flame. Ruined my hoodie with the smell. Ate a sandwich, read a few pages, tried to sleep. It was too quiet. City noise is a terrible lullaby, but it is a lullaby. Out here, silence had edges. Every creak sounded like a decision. I woke in the dark to a small, irregular sound, like a tongue clicking against teeth. Somewhere inside the cabin, then not. I told myself frog, bug, settling wood. Eventually, I dozed, then jolted awake needing to pee. I slid into my shoes, grabbed my flashlight, stepped outside. Cold slid under my sweatshirt, the kind that makes your shoulders rise. I went to the trees, finished, zipped, and heard the click again, nearer now. I killed the light. Nothing moved. No wind in the pines, no eyes. When I turned the beam back on, the clearing looked posed. I walked in slow, locked the door behind me, and sat until my breathing settled. The sound returned. Inside this time. Behind me, I aimed the light and saw nothing change. Dropped to the floor and pressed my ear to the planks. The clicking was softer there, deliberate, like something counting under my feet. Not scurrying, not claws. Just clicking. I'd noticed the crawlspace hatch earlier. Nailed shut from the inside, a fresh board across it. I stayed on the floor with the flashlight in one hand and my pocket knife in the other. Night stretched. Somewhere in the walls, a whispering started. Not words I could parse, more like breath pushed into shape. Stay, stay. Swells and false starts, like someone practicing a language they didn't own. Gray light slid in eventually. I walked the cabin's perimeter and found nothing until I looked at the dirt near the porch. Prints, bare, too wide. Toes too long, no obvious heel. Just a blunt pad and the suggestion of weight. They circled the porch and paused under each warped window. My rational brain tried on bear, cat, bad prank, and none of the sizes matched the shapes. I texted Jonas from the clearing anyway, arm up like a statue. No bars, then a flicker, then gone. Later by the door, one ping got out. Anyone else have keys? A bubble spun, then came his answer hours after. Just you. Daylight was a slow drip. I kept the knife on the table, rebuilt the fire, didn't nap, didn't relax. When the trees blackened into night again, I made a barricade that felt childish and necessary. Chair under the latch, cooler and suitcase stacked against the back door. I lay flat with the flashlight set where I could hit it with one hand without looking. The sounds came back later. The kind of later where your phone face would blind you. Not clicks at first, a whisper under the bed near the floorboards. Same halting rhythm, then something heavier slid across wood somewhere beneath me. A low groan you feel before you hear, skin on timber. I crouched with the knife and tried to be a smaller animal. The whisper faded, the weight below did not. I watched, waited, and the room didn't change until it did. Morning light showed the new thing. Muddy marks on my shirt and skin. Rounded, broad, no heel, no tread. I had no memory of sleeping, but I must have. The sensation that I'd been touched without consent made me nauseous in a way fear usually doesn't. I packed in minutes, everything messy into the trunk. I didn't check closets. I didn't sweep the place for proof. The road out was still frost patch slick. The car fishtailed twice and snapped my attention tight. I pulled over once, hands shaking, popped the trunk to resettle a bag, and froze. 4 black finger-wide smears streaked the inside of the lid. Oily, odorless, not quite fingerprints. I dropped the lid, got back in, and didn't stop again until pavement. Bars returned to my phone around 3:15 p.m. near a diner with a lot full of mud-coated trucks. I sent Jonas a message that was mostly punctuation. No reply. A week later, I noticed he'd stopped coming in. Shar didn't know where he'd gone. Nobody did. Back in Knoxville, every sound at home felt misfiled. Pipes knocking. A neighbor dragging a chair. Something in the walls expanding with heat. I locked my door and kept it locked. I told myself to stop thinking about the crawl space. About prints with no heels. About whisper breath trying to meet me in the middle. At night, the wind sometimes combs the trees behind my building, and a small crying floats through, fake or real, I can't say. When I wake to it, I hold the edge of my blanket and don't move. If I hear the gentle tap that isn't a tap in the baseboard near the bed, I say nothing. The quickest way to invite a thing is to answer it. I don't go back. I don't ask Jonas's number if anyone's seen him. I don't try to triangulate where the boot and the antlers and the road that turns to ribs might be. The mountains keep their own ledgers. Silence is not proof of safety. Walls learn your name faster than you think. If there's a moral, it's smaller than I want. Don't confuse quiet with refuge. Don't assume the only doors that matter are the ones you can see. And if you ever find yourself standing in a one-room cabin, counting the spaces between clicks coming from the floor, remember this: some places are happy to be found. Others only look that way while they're deciding what to keep. I wasn't chasing healing or some big moment. I just wanted quiet. My cousin Jace called and said, "Let's vanish for a week. No phones. Just a cabin." I worked nights at a warehouse in Birmingham and slept in pieces. A week with no alarm sounded perfect, so I said yes. We pulled out at 2 p.m. in his rattly Blazer and got off the highway fast. The nice asphalt turned to patched road, then to gravel, then to a skinny dirt lane under trees that met over our heads. The GPS gave up. The road looked like it wasn't meant for people anymore. We rolled into the clearing around 6 p.m. The place looked slapped together and left. Faded boards. One crooked shutter. A porch rail busted out. No other tracks, no voices. Just us and a wall clock inside that ticked way too loud for a clock. Inside was one big room pretending to be a few rooms. A soft old couch that smelled like damp. A tiny kitchen. 2 doors that led to little sleeping corners. I kept telling myself this was what I wanted. Nothing to listen to but wind and bugs. The first night was fine. We burned burgers over the fire ring, told old stories, watched stars come out until our necks hurt. The quiet felt clean. The next night didn't. I stepped outside in the dark because the little bathroom made a sound like a broken boat. The porch was rough under my feet. Trees were pale in the moonlight. I heard weight on dry leaves. One slow step, then a long pause, then another. Not a deer crash. Not coyotes, just someone taking their time, I whispered, "Jace," even though I knew he was inside. Breathing answered me, not animal, human, close. I didn't look around. I backed in and locked the door with both locks like a kid. In the morning, I pretended I'd made more of it than it was. I didn't tell Jace. We drove into the closest town for gas and ice. The place had one pump and a diner with half the letters burned out. I asked the guy at the counter if bears bug people up in that stretch. He held my eyes a second too long and said, "Folks don't stay up there." When I waited, he added, "They hear things," and that was it. That night, Jace shook me awake. He'd gone to the sink and seen someone in the trees. We crouched by the window and looked out. A shape stood past the yard. Still, too tall. The arms hung too low. The head was tilted like it was trying to hear through the glass. It didn't walk forward. Sort of slid a few feet, stopped, then slid again. We marched the dresser to the door and held the biggest kitchen knife between us. It paced out there for a long time. Sometimes it sounded like dragging, sometimes steps. Sometime before morning, the noise went away. When we checked the door, 4 deep cuts ran down the wood like someone bored and angry had pressed in metal and pulled. The fresh wood was pale and rough to the touch. "We're leaving," Jace said. I agreed so fast he laughed once without meaning to. We threw our stuff back in bags. I reached for the handle and saw marks carved into the frame above it. Not scratches. Tally marks. Straight and neat. A lot of them. I counted to 30 and stopped because my stomach felt weird. I told Jace it was just weather. He didn't push it. We tried to drive out the same way we came in and ran into trees. The road ended in trunks like it had never been there. We turned around, tried a different bend, and got more of the same. Every direction turned into more woods while our gas needle slid down. Then the shape stood in the road ahead. Arms down, head tipped. Jace swore and put it in reverse. He punched it, and we bounced and slid and yelled. And then we were on pavement like someone had moved us there. We should have kept going to the interstate. We didn't. The daylight made us stupid. Back at the cabin, we told each other we'd leave in the morning. That evening, a shadow passed across the kitchen window. Not pressed close, just moving by like a woman walking a line she'd walked 1,000 times. She didn't stop. She didn't look in. She just went by. The next night, about the same time, it happened again. I kept watch without meaning to. Like the part of my brain that should have said leave was busy waiting to see if she'd pause. A new sound started from the ceiling. A rope straining, creak, creak. Like a swing board or something heavy shifting on a beam. We stared up, waiting for feet to come through. Nothing did. The sound kept time with itself, patient and steady, and made my scalp feel cold. I yelled up at it without thinking. It stopped mid-creak like someone pinched it shut. The tally marks kept getting to me. I swear there were more each day. Fresh, pale cuts near old gray ones. Jace quit joking. I stopped sleeping. When the shadow slid past the glass, I thought I saw it nodding. Just a small dip, like the head moved in time with that ceiling sound. Maybe I made that up. It felt true. The last night is the one that stuck. The cheap clock banged away at every second. The wall seemed too close. The shadow came and hovered near the window instead of going by. Dust shook down from the beams with a long groan above us. And right there, while we stared at the doorframe, 4 new tally marks cut in, clean and bright, where there had been none. Like a hand we couldn't see was counting us in real time. We didn't argue. We ran, keys, bags, nothing folded, nothing checked. The blazer coughed into life, and we drove until trees became signs and signs became exits. Back home, Jace tried to find the listing. It was gone, no photos, no cached anything, fine by me. I wanted it to be over. A week later, an envelope with no return address showed up in my mailbox. Inside was a thin strip of wood, smooth on one side, and on the other, tallies. The last 2 were new, cut lighter than the rest. 2 marks, enough for both of us. I keep telling myself all I wanted was quiet. Turns out quiet isn't empty. The mountains can be quiet and still keep count. If I ever hear slow steps on dry leaves again, spaced just far enough apart to make you think, I hope I don't open the door. I hope that's all it takes. I wasn't hunting for a story. I was hunting for rent money. My name's Miles Ortiz, history major at Ashfield. I was 23, broke and stacking loans on top of late fees. My cousin Theo said a friend of his, Calder, owned an old hunting cabin way out in the Appalachians and needed someone to look in on it. 2 nights, make sure the roof hadn't caved and the generator still coughed to life. $200 cash, no forms, no questions. I left town at 2 p.m. with a dented cooler, a cheap headlamp, and a sleeping bag that smelled like the thrift store it came from. Asphalt turned to gravel. Gravel to a narrow path chewed into the hillside. Service bars vanished and didn't come back. A gate with a rusted chain hung open like the last person through never bothered locking it again. The cabin sat in a low clearing. Half swallowed by the trees, the wood gone that gray-green color you see on drifted fences. The porch leaned. 2 old rockers slumped like they were tired of being furniture. The door was heavy oak with iron hinges that could stop a truck. The windows were thin and high, more slits than windows. Inside, the place had the kind of emptiness that hums. 1 crooked chair, 1 table, a cot with a rolled sleeping bag someone else had used a lifetime ago. A fireplace glazed black with soot, a little propane stove that gave off a faint stink, like someone had left a valve just shy of closed. On one wall, rifles sat on pegs. Dust on dust. Below them, boxes of shells stacked and forgotten. I didn't touch any of it. I set my stuff down like a polite guest. Out back, the generator perched on cinder blocks, paint flaking. A half can of gas waited beside it. I poured primed, tugged the cord. It coughed, screeched, then settled into a chest-deep growl that made the air feel thick. Inside, the lights flickered, buzzed, and miracle held. I boiled instant rice on the propane burner and ate it from the pot. I sat on the porch until the trees went black, and the clearing felt like the only island left in the world. It wasn't peaceful exactly. It was empty. No airplanes, no dogs. Not even owls. Just wine moving in the branches. And once in a while, a dry twig snapping somewhere you couldn't point to. Sometime after midnight, something out there shifted. Not a crash. A weight moving slow, maybe 40 feet off. I told myself deer don't stomp. Bears don't tiptoe. I went inside, dropped the bar across the door, and tried the cot. I woke with my heart already racing and no idea why. Then came a knock, not on the door. On the wall, 1 clean rap like knuckles on a desk. I held my breath until it hurt. Another single knock answered from a different wall. Then nothing. Long enough to think I imagined it. Then another somewhere else. No fast pattern. No let me in. Just taps placed far apart like someone was mapping the room from the outside. I slid to the nearest window and pushed my forehead to the glass. The beam from my headlamp flattened against the wall and died at the edge of the clearing. Just trees. A clunk from out back made me flinch. The generator choked and went dead. Not a sputter from low fuel. It sounded like someone flipped the switch. I ran barefoot, light swinging wild. The cinder blocks sat quiet. Nothing moved. No prints I could read in the soft dirt. I flipped the switch back. Nothing. I went in, locked everything a second time, and sat with my back to the wall until the gray of morning seeped through. Daylight made me brave. I climbed the roof, pushed off knee-deep pine needles, pressed on a soft board, and felt it sink under my palm. I walked the tree line and found a trunk torn open. 4 gouges ripped down the bark, uneven and raw, starting 6 feet up. Not saw marks, not neat. Angry. I took a picture out of habit and saved it to a phone that couldn't talk to anyone. I told myself to stick to the plan. 2 nights, make notes, collect cash. That afternoon I stayed on the porch with the rifle leaned where I could see it. I didn't load it. I just needed the weight of it nearby. The woods went quiet again in that not right way, like the whole place was listening to me breathe. Dark came fast. I barred the door and sat on the floor, knees up, the rifle across my legs. The knocks returned, louder. 4, then 5. A long slide of pressure along the boards, low, like a palm dragging the length of the wall. Then around the corner, the same. as if whoever it was liked the sound it made. I kept still until my teeth ached from clenching. Something small slipped under the door and knocked lightly into my boot. Stone, round, smooth, too smooth to belong here. It looked like a worry bead someone had carried in a pocket for years. I kicked it back through the gap hard enough to feel silly. Breathing answered on the other side of the wood. Not panting, listening. Slow in, slow out, I didn't sleep. I watched the nail heads in the planks and told myself if one moved, I'd run. Neither happened. Light finally bled across the floorboards and birds, finally, made noise. I packed in 5 minutes. Left the pan where it cooled. Left the rifle where it leaned. Left the generator dead and the door barred. The plan was drive, then call Theo and tell him to hand Calder his keys and forget my name. On the way out, a sheet of something white flashed at the edge of my sight. A piece of paper was nailed to a tree at eye level. I didn't want to look. I looked anyway. It was a photo. Me, night one, sitting on the porch with the headlamp cutting a cone through the dark. A bag of chips at my knee. Taken from the trees, clean, close, not blurry. I didn't stop. I didn't touch it. I drove downhill until the ruts turned to gravel. Until gravel decided to remember how to be a road. Service bars crept back and my phone hummed like a bee in a jar. I called Theo and said, I'm done. Don't send anybody. I meant to hang the whole thing on lack of sleep and a bad imagination. My brain wouldn't let me. Because there were 2 other things. One happened before I left, and one as I was leaving. Just before dawn, while I stared at the ceiling trying not to blink, I heard a rope above the rafters take weight. That slow creak. Creak you only hear on old barn swings or when someone uses a beam for something worse. I grabbed the chair and climbed. Dust, shadows, no rope. No hook, no nothing. Still, the sound kept time with my heartbeat until I spoke out loud. Then it shut off like I'd pulled a plug. The other thing was the window. I sat there with the lamp off, looking at the thin glass as it threw my face back at me. My reflection lifted a hand and waved once. I didn't move. My hands were on my knees. The wave was small, polite, like 2 people passing on the same side of the street. I told myself I was seeing the lamp ghosting in the pane. I told myself lots of things. At the last bend in the track, I gave in and looked back just once to prove the cabin was really there and that I had actually been inside it. There was no clearing, no roofline, no crooked porch, only trees I didn't recognize growing shoulder to shoulder where the cabin should have been. Bark dark with morning, like the whole place had been rolled up and walked away while I packed my bag. I reached the highway around 6 p.m. and kept driving until billboards and brake lights felt like proof we'd all agreed the world was real. I sent Theo a single text. Paid or not, I'm not going back. Some nights I wake because I'm sure I heard a single knock. Not on my apartment door, on the wall. Spaced out patient, like someone is counting how long it takes me to answer. And every time I close my eyes, I picture that smooth little stone tapping my boot, and that photo nailed to the tree, from a spot I never saw. A place that was there 1 minute and nothing the next. We left Silver Creek on a gray October morning, the kind that makes the mountains look like they're exhaling. Mom said we needed a reset. Dad said he'd found a quiet little place online. My little brother, Noah, clutched his toy train and kicked his boots against the back of my seat. I'm Lena, oldest child, designated navigator, and not exactly thrilled. We pulled out at 8 a.m. with a cooler, a box of board games missing half the pieces, and the stubborn hope that a cabin would cure whatever city life had ground down in us. The highway folded into 2-lane, then 1. Oak and pine stacked higher, darker. The sky kept sagging. By the time we turned onto the forest road, the SUV's windows were fogging from our breathing. We reached the cabin around 2:15 p.m. It sat crooked at the edge of a slope, a dark rectangle shouldered by trees, like it had been set down and then forgotten. Shingles curled like fingernails. One shutter hung by a single rusted screw and tapped the siding when the wind bothered to move. Inside, cold air and old dust. A wood stove with a belly full of ash. 2 narrow bedrooms. A living room with a slumped couch and a wall clock that ticked too loud for its size. The quiet wasn't soft. It was watchful. You could feel it on your neck. We unpacked. Mom wiped the counters twice for no reason. Dad tested the light switches. pleased when a bulb hummed itself awake. Noah drove his train along the windowsill and asked if bears knew how to knock. I wandered toward the tree line. The narrow path ran along a split-rail fence, past a hand-painted sign that said, "No trespassing. Shale Ridge Pit." "Old coal cut," Dad had said when we booked it. "Long sealed," the sign leaned. The ground sloped into a mouth of rock and shadow where the cut bit into the hill. I stopped long before the drop. The air coming out of that hole smelled like coins and wet paper. Something said my name, not loud, not from a shape. It threaded out of the cold air like a thought I didn't want. Lena. I waited for a branch to creak it into sense. The wind held still. Told myself it was a bird, turned around and tried to let the trees be trees. At dinner, the cabin shifted. Not literally, just a feeling of it settling closer. The windows ticked in their frames. The clock sounded like it had moved nearer to my ear. Mom stirred chili and said we were lucky to have a weekend with no signal. Dad raised his spoon like a toast. Noah asked again about bears. I slept badly. Every old board in the place knows how to speak. And sometime after midnight, one of them said footsteps. Slow, careful ones that traveled from the kitchen to our bedroom door and stopped long enough for me to hold my breath and feel my heartbeat in my throat. I stared at the gap below the door for a shadow that never formed. Morning came thin and colorless. My pillow smelled faintly like damp stone. We noticed it at breakfast. The front door lock sat vertical, the way you leave it when you lock from the inside. And yet our duffel bags weren't on the bench where we dropped them. Coats missing from hooks. The cupboard bare when Mom swore she'd stacked oatmeal there the night before. Dad walked the perimeter, baffled and quietly angry in the way dads get when a problem refuses to have a box to check. No broken glass, no tracks on the porch. Noah refused to step back inside after he saw the empty hooks. "A tall man in the corner," he whispered, eyes on the farthest wall. "He doesn't blink." We lied and told him he was brave. We tried the phones and got a polite nothing. Dad said we'd drive toward the ranger station to pick up a bar or two, and maybe our bags had been moved by the cleaning crew. Ridiculous. But you say things like that when the air has edges. We loaded in. The track back to the county road wound through a belt of red maples and then gray rock. We rounded one blind curve and saw a young woman standing with her thumb out, hair wet like she'd just climbed out of a river. She never looked straight at us, just into the trees opposite like she expected something to step out and explain itself. Mom told Dad to stop. He eased onto the shoulder. I twisted to check the back seat, already rehearsing a polite version of "we don't have room." There wasn't anybody there. I snapped my head forward. The shoulder was empty too. Just road and trees and the gentle lie of heat coming off the hood. We sat without speaking for a full minute, like the car had turned to stone. We didn't make it to a ranger. The road ran us in a quiet circle and delivered us back to our own tire tracks. "Old forest roads do that," Dad said, but his voice had to climb a hill to reach us. When we pulled into the clearing again, the cabin seemed closer to the trees by the width of a hand. That evening, the wind dropped to nothing. The woods had that muffled quality of a church when no one's inside. Noah kept glancing at the corner by the stove. Mom set cards on the table and tried for a laugh that didn't land. The clock gave up pretending and just ticked like a second hand pressed to my temple. After dark, the mind breathed. I didn't go back there, I just knew it did. Cold air rolled up the slope and under the door. I could taste coal when I swallowed. Somewhere along the rafters, a slow creak started and settled into a rhythm I didn't like. The sound of a rope with real weight on it. You don't mistake that. It finds a bad part of your brain and squeezes. I told Dad I'd heard an animal. He told me animals don't tie knots. The next morning, the footprints were there. Not really prints, shapes in damp leaf mold along the porch. Wider than a person's, splayed toes too long, no heel. They ran to each window and stopped, like someone counted the panes and approved. When I looked too long, I felt a kind of pressure at the back of my eyes, like a headache practicing. We argued in the soft voice people use when a child is in the room. Mom said we should leave and risk the road. Dad said we weren't lost, just turned around. I said I'd never wanted a hotel so badly in my life. Noah wouldn't touch his cereal. He stared toward the bedroom door and said, "He's in there." I went to the threshold and waited for a shape to peel itself out of the shadow. Nothing moved. Then the smell of coal smoke lifted through the hall, thin and specific. though the stove hadn't been lit since last night and the chimney was clean. We tried the road again, later. It looped and gave us the same bend, the same rock with a pale seam like a scar. The same downed branch we had dragged aside in the morning sat across our lane again. The mountains did not say no. They just set the pieces back where they'd been. That night the cabin shifted. Doors we'd closed stood a finger's width ajar. The clock advanced and then ticked back, catching itself before it could be wrong. At the bedroom window, a woman's shadow drifted by as if walking a path she'd paced for 100 years. She didn't press her face to the glass or turn to look in. She passed with the offhand confidence of ownership. Overhead, the rope sound grew so steady, I could have set a metronome to it. Dust came down in grains. I stared at the ceiling until my eyes watered and whispered stop into my sleeve. It paused, then started again, patient. Near midnight, I went to the edge of the mine with a flashlight and the terrible idea that maybe understanding would help. The beam disappeared after a few feet, swallowed whole. The air from that hole made the hair on my arms rise. The whisper found me again, closer now, urgent and somehow polite. It used my name like it had practiced. I took one step back and felt the drop of the cut at my heels, as if the ground had edged nearer, while I wasn't watching. When I came back, the cabin wore small changes like bruises. A chair turned the wrong direction. Our deck of cards arranged in 4 perfect stacks without suits. The front door frame had new marks in it. Little cuts tidy and deep like someone had been counting and forgot to stop. I counted to 30 before my stomach soured. We left before sunrise. We didn't pack. We just carried Noah and the keys and a prayer that the road would decide to be a road again. It did, as if we'd paid a toll we didn't remember paying. By mid-morning, the mountains fell behind us like a bad story folding shut. Years later, I still hear it sometimes when the house is quiet. The low hush of a shaft breathing from far underground. The tiny clatter of a card being set down by a hand I can't see. My name said in a voice that doesn't belong to anyone I love. Some places don't haunt you with a face. They haunt you with repetition. The same bend, the same tick, the same whisper. Until the ordinary wears thin and you realize the mountain hasn't forgotten you. And when I pass a mirror at night, I have to stop myself from counting the little marks in the wood of the doorframe, because I know I'll find one I don't remember making. I'm a ranger. I've spent enough nights in the Appalachians to know what's normal and what isn't. The way wind threads a ridge. The way owls trade calls. The way silence means either weather or a catamount you'll never see. That evening felt wrong from the moment I turned up Crow Ridge Road. The fog sat thick on the switchbacks. Wet light bouncing back into my windshield so hard, it felt like I was driving inside a flashlight. I eased the Jeep around a bend and there she was in the beams. White dress, no sound, no step. Not standing so much as drifting, like the ground didn't hold her. Every instinct said brake, reverse, call it in. I couldn't move. It felt like the woods put a hand flat on my chest and held me there. When I blinked, she was gone. The road was just fog again and trees pressing in, water shining on bark like eyes. A few days earlier, a hunter had cornered me at the station, jittery, swearing he found a skeleton tied to a poplar in a cut he wouldn't exactly name. The bones were old, he said, but the clothes looked new. Like somebody dressed it yesterday, he told me, voice dragging on the words. I chalked it up to campfire exaggeration and told him to mark a map. He didn't. It stuck anyway. I set a small camp near Panther Creek when the light went thin. Standard check, bear lines up, stove off, tent zipped. The creek carried cold up the draw and the fog settled like wool. I walked a slow circle with my headlamp off to listen. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, small ones, quick and even like kids trying to sneak but not trying hard enough. They ran on dry leaves, circled, then stopped. I swept the light. No prints in the soft spots. No breathing. Just the heavy nothing you get right before a thunderhead. Only the sky was clean. Back at the tent, I radioed a routine check and turned on the little AM to fill the quiet. Static, then faint giggling came through like it was tuned to the gap between stations. I clicked it off. The laughter kept going for a breath in my head, then faded. Hair lifted on my arms like a cold hand had brushed by. Next day, I walked a ridge I know too well. The old stone church up top, roof clawed in, pews long gone, one bell still hanging half-cracked in the steeple. Old rangers joke about the October toll, say you'll hear it with no wind and no people, and you'll think you're fine until the second chime hits your ribs. I figured I'd prove to myself it was just rust and wire and luck. The first strike landed while I was still 30 yards out. Not loud so much as deep, a sound that started in the metal and finished in my shoes. No breeze moved the hemlocks. The second came slower, and the ridge seemed to give it back, the way a barn gives back a voice when you shout inside. My throat went dry in a way coffee doesn't fix. I did my loop anyway, down through a hollow where the fog pooled, across an old logging cut, back past a turnout on the parkway that tourists love when the leaves are right. I saw the white dress again there, off the guardrail, just inside the trees where you'd think she was a sign. She turned, or I think she did. Fog will lie to you. And the bell answered from a mile of ridge away, dull and patient. After dark, the creek camp felt smaller. The tent walls breathed with me. I heard the light, quick steps again outside. A child's game circle around nylon. Then long stretches of nothing that made the nothing seem loud. You're tired, I told myself. You're stacking stories in your own head. Then my name floated out of the fog in a whisper that didn't belong to any voice I knew. Sometimes one voice, sometimes many soft together like a classroom when the teacher steps out. I put boots on and stepped into the milk of it, beam low to the ground. The light ate itself. Every tree was a person and no tree was. Something brushed by, air moving without body, and I could smell wet iron the way you do when somebody cuts a finger and hides it. I backed up until my shoulders touched the Jeep. The rest of the night turned into a loop. The bell tolled, slow, careful, like whatever rung it had all the time in the world. Leaves ticked like small feet. The woman in white hovered at the limit of every beam, not closer, not gone. The picture of that poplar with the dressed bones pushed into my mind, until I couldn't think anything else. I kept trying to explain it all away with the usual ranger answers. Wind, prank, echo, nerves. The answers bounced off like rain on oil. Somewhere after midnight, I tried to break the spell by walking hard toward the church clearing. Branches snapped back into my jacket. Fog pushed up the draw and swallowed the path I'd made 10 minutes before. The bell hit again, closer somehow, and the laughter rose out of the static of my pocket radio. Even though the radio was in my pack, zipped. Enough, I said out loud to no one. You win. I'm leaving at first light. The woods didn't answer, which was worse. Morning took its time. When pale came up under the trees, the place looked ordinary again. Dew on grass, spiderwebs tugging between stems. One crow ripping noise out of the quiet. I packed like a rookie, hands clumsy, everything wrong, and got the Jeep pointed downhill. On the way out, I passed the parkway turnout and made myself pull over, if only to prove the road was still there and the sky still big. I stood and listened to traffic far off, a sound I'd never been so glad to hear. The bell didn't sound. The fog had thinned. I told myself I'd write the whole thing up as unusual activity noted. No public hazard. I've written it that way twice now and thrown it out both times. Back at the station, people ask the kind of questions rangers ask other rangers. How was it up there? Any bear sign? I said the usual things. Quiet, nothing much. The hunter hasn't come back. I haven't gone to look for his poplar. I still run that patrol. I still take the switchbacks and listen to the tires crush gravel. And I still check Panther Creek when the leaves turn. I leave the radio off. When October comes, I give the church a wider berth and pretend it's because the trail is washed out. If I have to be up there after dark, I keep the Jeep moving and don't look into the trees more than I need. Here's the part I don't put in the log. On windless nights, miles from Crow Ridge, I'll be driving a quiet stretch and hear one clean chime from nowhere, and I'll feel it land in my boots again. Or a giggle will ride a gust through the open bay doors at the station, too light to be any kid I know, and my name will float up behind it in a voice that isn't anyone's. People think mountains are dirt and rock and weather. They are also memory. They don't forget. If you wander far enough into the folds and fog, they decide what parts of you walk back out. I left with a beating heart and a good truck, sure, but some slice of me is still on that ridge, between the bell and the white dress, listening for small feet in the leaves and hoping morning hurries. We left campus at 9 a.m. in 2 cars with borrowed tents, instant coffee, and the kind of confidence you only have before you've seen the place you're going. I'm Leah Morgan, secretary of the Archaeology Club, and I figured Crow Hollow would give me a few decent photos for the newsletter and a quiet weekend, away from group chats and studio noise. We reached the trailhead around 1:45 p.m. The first thing that hit me was how tall everything felt. Not just trees, walls. Trunks mossy and wide, branches braided together so the light came down in thin lines like we were underwater. A retired trail hand, Mr. Fallow, met us near the map board. He was friendly enough until he asked where we were camping. When we said Crow Hollow Loop, he glanced at the tree line and told us a story he swore was true. A woman he'd seen years ago, standing just inside the trees, not touching the ground, and no footprints where she'd been. He said it like a warning, not a campfire tale. We laughed anyway, the way students do when a grown-up tries to spook them. I still felt something pinch in my stomach. Our professor wanted us to check a derelict homestead a mile or so in, an old timber cabin the park notes mentioned. The roofline sagged. The air inside had that cold, sweet smell of wet wood. On a table, we found 3 leather notebooks streaked with mildew. The handwriting inside ran small and fast. It talked about nights when they come for the little ones and whole families folded into the trees. The way it was written, no flourishes, no poetry, made it worse. By late day, we set our tents in a flat spot near a ring of stones that looked like it used to be a fire pit. I brought a cheap handheld AM/FM radio to catch ambient sound for the club's Instagram. I was turning the dial for static and bird calls when it found a noise that didn't belong. Children laughing, bright, clear, and close, coming out of a dead station. We all went quiet. The laughter didn't fade. It seemed to circle us. No kids, no other campers, just the trees. I clicked the radio off. The laughter kept going for a breath, like it was trying to decide if it needed the speaker or not, then stopped. Dusk turned fast. Tents went up. Someone joked about haunted parks. I walked a little toward the trees to pee and saw her. A shape of a woman between 2 maples, hair moving although the air was still. She wasn't far, but I couldn't make out her face. She drifted forward an inch without stepping. I didn't scream, but my throat tried. When I blinked, there was only space where she'd been and the feeling you get when someone leaves a room. That night was all almosts. Almost footsteps. Almost voices. A branch that almost snapped and then didn't. I kept the radio off, but the little speaker made a dry hiss anyway, like it was breathing. We tried to hike out at first light. The professor took point with the map. We followed blazes, then found ourselves back at the same cabin, same crooked steps, same table with the diaries. We tried a different fork. Same result, same clearing, same rock with a stripe of quartz we recognized. Someone swore we'd been counting turns wrong. We marked a tree with orange tape. An hour later, we saw the tape on a trunk we hadn't passed. That's when nobody made jokes. By late morning, the woman kept showing up at the edges. Every time I looked full on, she wasn't there. Every time I looked away, I could feel her in the corner of my eye, like a smudge you can't wipe from your glasses. She didn't rush us. She didn't reach. She just kept pace. The radio started again by itself, not music. Giggles, a skipping rope rhyme in a language I didn't know. The kind of sound you'd expect in a schoolyard, bright and wrong in the middle of the trees. Our professor took the batteries out. The sound stopped. A minute later, the speaker ticked and the laughter returned. Thin this time, like it had to come a longer way to get to us. We left the radio in the cabin. It was in my pack again an hour later. I don't remember putting it there. The woods tightened. Trails that were wide the first time seemed narrower. The air in the hollows felt cold enough to sting teeth. When the wind moved, the leaves didn't. When the leaves moved, the air didn't. We started talking in low voices without meaning to. A couple of the younger members cried and tried not to. Nobody blamed them. By afternoon, I'd stopped checking the time. That was when I noticed the pattern. The cabin, the clearing, the diaries, the radio, loop, loop, loop. It didn't feel like we were lost. It felt like we'd been put into someone else's memory and told to walk it, until we understood. I thought about the diary pages mentioning folded into the trees, and felt a pressure in my chest. The kind you get before a panic attack. We reached the clearing again, and the woman stood to the left of the old well. Closer now. Her hair hung straight. Her feet hovered a thumb's width above the moss. No prints anywhere. She tilted her head the way a person does when they're trying to hear something far away, and then turned. Not like a person turns, more like a cloud shifting, and slid out of sight. The sound of kids laughing fizzed in the treetops above us and rolled down the trunks like rain. We decided to sit tight until the professor could get his bearings. Sitting felt worse. The woods had a weight to them, like a held breath. I kept thinking about the guide's story and how sure he'd sounded. I kept thinking about how old the laughter felt, like it had been recorded and replayed 1,000 times until the edges wore smooth. Near sundown, we tried one last time. The blazes led us to the road. The road bent back to the cabin. We came out at the clearing from the opposite side and still hit the same stones, the same stump with the same square of lichen shaped like a county. The radio in my pack clicked and gave one bright giggle, and that, more than anything, made me feel like a bug in a jar. We did get out, if you can call it that. We walked without talking until the trees thinned, and then the lot was just there, like it had decided to be. We loaded the cars without looking at each other, and drove until the mountains turned to folds in the rear-view mirror. When my service bars came back, I checked the photos on my phone. Shots of bark, of sky, of our boots. On 3 of them, there's a faint white blur over the ground, the shape of a hem maybe, and nothing touching the leaves. I sleep fine most nights. Then once in a while I'll wake up because I've heard children laughing in a room that doesn't have any, or I'll catch a smear of someone standing where the wall meets the floor and feel sure there's no footprint to match it. When the club asks me to write our trip summary, I keep stalling. I don't have a thesis, only this. Some places don't try to scare you. They remember you. They run the same piece of tape until you realize you're on it. Crow Hollow felt like that. A loop, a lesson, a warning told with simple tools. A cabin, a few pages, a voice that doesn't need your radio to be heard. And somewhere at the tree line, a woman who never quite lands.